Imagine stepping into the glittering court of Tudor England. Velvet gowns shimmer under candlelight. Strings of pearls sway from every noble neck. The scent of rose oil and clove hangs thick in the air. But breathe in just a little deeper and you might gag. Because beneath the lace, jewels, and powdered faces, royal women of Tudor England lived lives that were, quite literally, crawling with rot. I'm your host, Cloaked Testament, and this is the Timeworn Record, where we deep dive into the most mysterious corners of history, unveiling the truths or myths that have been hidden or forgotten. What could possibly be hidden behind the curtain today? This was the era of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. It was a golden age of courtly manners, grand banquets, and towering fashion. But it was also an age without running water, without antibiotics, and without the faintest clue how germs worked. Behind the painted masks of power and poise, Tudor noblewomen were enduring a daily battle against disease, odor, and filth. These are the 5 most disturbing hygiene horrors they faced. And trust me, they're far worse than you'd imagine. Let's begin with what was arguably the crown jewel of courtly appearance hair. Except that in the Tudor court, what sat atop? A woman's head was often more of a pest hotel than a hairstyle. Wigs were a status symbol, especially under Elizabeth I, who famously wore flame red wigs stacked high above her forehead. But here's what most history books leave out. Those wigs were infested. And I don't mean the occasional louse, I mean entire colonies. Noble women shaved their heads to help their wigs fit better, which did nothing to prevent lice. In fact, the wigs were made of human or horse hair, padded with wool or cloth, and slathered in pomade made from bear fat, pig fat, or beef tallow. Greasy and warm perfect conditions for lice. Women would spend hours having their wigs styled, powdered and pinned, only to carry around these living, itching burdens day after day. Washing them was out of the question. That would ruin the shape. Instead, they used silver lice combs and delicate ivory scratchers to quietly scrape at their scalps, while sitting through banquets and court ceremonies. Some even carried tiny scratching tools in their sleeves. Imagine pausing mid-toast, smiling at a nobleman, and then sliding a needle between your wig seams to calm the itch from hundreds of biting lice. And yet, this was preferable to showing up with unstyled natural hair. Fashion was law, even if your head felt like it was on fire. But as bad as your scalp might itch, there was a deeper, smellier problem lurking just below the surface. Literally, Tudor palaces like Hampton Court were architectural marvels, massive, ornate, and filled with the wealth of the kingdom. But they lacked one key feature: toilets. There were no flushing systems, no plumbing, and no sewage disposal, just chamber pots. Noble women kept these under beds, in corners, or behind velvet curtains. When nature called, they used their pots discreetly, and then a servant would empty them. Hopefully, if not, the smell lingered. And if no pot was nearby, you'd better believe noble women would relieve themselves wherever they could, sometimes right there in the gardens, tucked behind a hedge. Some courtiers preferred to hold it, rather than risk the embarrassment of being seen carrying a pot, which made entire court events a test of bladder endurance. Public corridors reeked, the lower floors of palaces, especially near kitchens, were sometimes flooded with the stench of urine and worse. The truly unlucky servant was the groom of the stool, whose job was to manage the king's toilet needs. Women had their own attendants, called chamberers, who were expected to clean up their mistress's waste, sometimes even wiping them. This was a full-time job, and yet daily cleaning was not a thing. In fact, royal households only required cleaning once a week, if that. Now, if the toilets weren't revolting enough, we need to talk about something even more intimate and even more taboo: menstruation. Tudor women didn't have tampons or pads. They had rags, plain linen clouts that they folded, tucked between their legs, and hoped would hold. There was no elastic, no adhesives, no waterproof layers. Just fabric, washed and reused by hand, often without soap. And when these rags leaked, there were no spare changes. Long skirts and corsets weren't just fashion, they were camouflage. Periods were considered dirty and unmentionable. Even among women, discussing menstruation was frowned upon. There were no doctors to turn to for cramps or irregular cycles. Many believed menstruation was a form of bodily purging to balance the humors. Others thought it made women emotionally unstable or physically impure. The lack of sanitation led to frequent infections, especially urinary and vaginal ones. But women were expected to carry on through courtly dances, banquets, and ceremonies without so much as a wince. No complaints, no breaks, just blood, linen, and silence. But the most grotesque truth of all? It wasn't lice or menstruation or even chamber pots. It was childbirth. In Tudor England, childbirth wasn't just a medical event. It was a national performance. Especially if you were queen, a royal pregnancy meant the future of the kingdom was at stake. And so, when labour began, it wasn't in private. The queen was surrounded by midwives, noblewomen, courtiers, even ambassadors. The room would be packed with observers, all watching her scream, sweat, and tear while trying to produce a viable heir. Why? Because the fear of baby switching ran deep. If the baby was stillborn or a girl, there were worries that it would be swapped for a boy. So everything had to be seen. When Jane Seymour gave birth to Henry VIII's only legitimate son, Edward VI, she laboured for 3 days. The strain killed her. Queen Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth wife, died just days after childbirth due to puerperal, fever and infection that spread from dirty hands or unclean tools. Even Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, had a front row seat to this horror. Though she never gave birth, she attended the confinements of her ladies, watching their agony unfold. She knew the risk. Every birth could be a death sentence. And yet, the pressure to produce heirs was constant. Noble women were expected to recover quickly, conceive again, and return to court looking flawless as if nothing had happened. No trauma, no grief, just duty. Still think Tudor royalty lived like fairy tale princesses? Let's turn to beauty, the kind that kills you slowly. Because if you were a noble woman in Tudor England, your face was both a battlefield and a mask. The ideal look was pale skin, ruby lips, and ghost white teeth. But achieving that meant covering your face in Venetian ceruse, the paste made of white lead and vinegar. Lead? Yes, the toxic metal. Women applied it daily, sometimes thick enough to crack if they smiled. It gave the illusion of porcelain perfection, but it also absorbed through the skin and poisoned the body from the inside out. Lead caused paralysis, fatigue, and brain damage. It made hair fall out and blackened the teeth. Queen Elizabeth I wore this poison almost every day for decades. By the end of her life, her skin was pockmarked, her teeth were rotting, and her hair was thinning. She doubled down on makeup to cover it, making the cycle worse. Some noble women painted their veins blue to look more delicate. Others used mercury to fade freckles. And when their teeth fell out from all the sugar they were eating, they simply smiled less or stuffed cotton in their cheeks to hide the gaps. So much for royal radiance. Let's recap. These were the most powerful women in Tudor England. They could influence politics, armies, even the fate of nations. But they had to do it while infested with lice, bleeding into linen rags, blacking their teeth with sugar and lead, urinating in chamber pots, and giving birth in rooms full of strangers, all while pretending it was glamorous. They weren't just fighting for power. They were fighting to stay clean, alive, and sane, in a world where medicine was superstition and beauty could kill. So the next time someone says they wish they lived in the past, remind them of the wigs filled with insects, the cosmetics laced with poison, and the chamber pots sitting beneath silk-covered thrones. Because history isn't always a fairy tale. Sometimes it's a horror story wrapped in velvet. Until next time, I'm Cloaked Testament, and this has been the Timeworn Record. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and don't forget behind every powdered face in history was a whole lot of dirt.